So today I want to continue our series on Indigenous learning. And today we're going to talk about reserves. Why do reserves exist for Indigenous people? Well, reserves actually started in the 18th and 19th centuries as a way of trying to sort out how settlers and Indigenous people could live side by side, because we had very different ideas of what private property was. In practice, what happened is reserves tended to be located far from where the settlers were, often hundreds, thousands of miles away. And in Canada, there are now just a little bit more than 3,000 reserves all over the country. In Ontario, we have 203, and here's a map of where the reserves are. As you can see, those little red dots represent the reserves, and as you can see, there aren't very many in the Golden Horseshoe, just a couple, whereas the rest tend to be up north. The thing about reserves is that they're not very big relative to the number of people who live on them. The original formula for creating reserves was that, and the formula changed depending on where you were, but it was basically they wanted to take Indigenous people and turn them into farmers, to assimilate them, to bring them Christianity, make them follow white Canadian ways. And so the way they did that was that they said, we want you to become farmers. So each nuclear family was given between 20 acres and 160 acres, sometimes 640 acres worth of land. It depended on where you lived. Often the land was up in the north in places where the white settlers didn't want to farm because the soil wasn't very good. So even if you had 640 acres, it was really hard to make a living. The problem with this was that a lot of Indigenous people didn't want to be farmers, or the kind of farming that they did before settlers arrived had been done in large groups. We've all seen pictures of longhouses. Many of the Indigenous villages had large cornfields around them, but the idea of just doing it family by family was foreign to them. Just to give you an example, the Indigenous people who lived here in Toronto when Toronto, the city of Toronto, was set up, were the Mississaugas of the New Credit. And here is a picture of where their traditional hunting grounds were when settlers arrived. They would go from what is now Port Credit, along Lake Ontario, up the Humber River and other rivers up to Lake Simcoe, where they would hunt for deer, and then bring the pelts back down the rivers and then back to the Port Credit area. So it's an enormous stretch of land. And when they sold land to settlers, they assumed that they would be able to continue to hunt and fish on that land, and they'd be able to pass through. However, that didn't work out so well. The settlers didn't like Indigenous people trespassing on their property, even though the treaty said that they had that right. And so in time, the Mississaugas of the New Credit were given their own reserve out in Port Credit on the Credit River. And this is and it was about just 200 acres. And even there, their fishing rights were abrogated by the settlers. Salmon used to run up the Credit River. And unfortunately, the settlers put mills across the Credit River, so the salmon run died out. And it was very hard to coexist with the settlers. So they decided to move to another reserve, the Six Nations Reserve out near Brantford, which is still there. And here's a map of how much land they have at the Six Nations Reserve. As you can see, it's tiny. It's really, really small. And this is what's happened to Indigenous people all over Canada. They started out with a lot of land, which they shared with settlers, and they ended up on reserves which were far away from often where they had been living originally, and they end up on reserves which are very, very small. Now, there's another problem with the reserve system, and that's that under federal law, all land on the reserves is actually owned by the federal government. This is part of the Indian Act, which is the legislation which governs the relationship between the federal government and Indigenous peoples. Under the Indian Act, reserves are land held in trust by the federal government, which means that the federal government gets to decide whether a reserve can have pieces torn off and given to other interests. So if a municipality or a local company makes a strong case for they would really like to have a golf course or a mine on reserved land, it's actually the federal government that makes the decision, not the band that lives on the reserve. And in fact, the oil and minerals and gas which lies under the ground in the reserve, that's also owned by the federal government. So reserves have often started off much smaller than the traditional lands and then have shrunk and shrunk and shrunk as pieces have been carved off by the federal government, private interests, and municipal interests to make things like golf courses and mines and other things. And that's why we see so many, every couple of years there's a standoff between Indigenous people and the police, often because someone has decided that they have too much reserve and some of that reserve should be taken for other uses. And they're resisting against that because they can't simply say, this is our land, you can't trespass. Because under Canadian law, it isn't their land, it's the federal government's land. Further complicating life on the reserve is the fact that under the Indian Act, services such as education and healthcare and water sewage treatment, those are all to be provided by the federal government. Now, if you think about your own life here in Toronto, you know that the federal government has very little to do with healthcare. That's a provincial jurisdiction. When we talk about schools, we talk about the Toronto District School Board because education is provided by both the province as well as cities, but not by the federal government. We don't ask Ottawa to determine the curriculum of our schools or to provide our teachers or to set our standards for education. But on reserves, because of the Indian Act, all of that has to go through the federal government, which doesn't have much experience with providing health care or education. And so as a result, the provision of services is often substandard or late or lacking. And in many reserves, school stops at grade 8 or grade 9, and the kids still have to leave the reserve to go to some other city to get high school. So there's a lot of things about reserves which are problematic. And if you'd like to hear more about this, on Tuesday night at 7:30, we're going to hear a talk given by two people who live on a reserve about 300 or 400 kilometers north of Thunder Bay. Allison and Leo are family members of Rosemary and Alan Dick, and you'll see Alan in just a minute. He's going to be reading our scripture. Allison Norman is Rosemary's goddaughter, and she works on a reserve teaching in one of the schools there, and she married Leo, who is a member of the Ojibwe Nation, and they're taking some vacation time down here in the city, and they have agreed to talk to us on Zoom about what it's like to live on a reserve. So if you'd like to really find out what's going on a reserve, please tune in on Tuesday night at 7:30, and the Zoom codes, of course, will be on our website. So that ends our Indigenous Learning Time today. Thank you for listening.